Good evening to those bored enough to watch. Undertale is a game that I've replayed a fair few times and I've had an enjoyable experience with it in the midst of that. The game has a lot of components such as the story and the gameplay that I find myself appreciating each time I do so, as it encourages replaying the game and accommodates those who are willing to take the time to do so, with Undertale setting a good foundation for creating a great first time experience and maintaining that for those revisiting the game, it's only natural that fan games would take those principles to try and apply them in their own way. Hence, in this video, I want to talk about how Undertale and the fan games I've discussed on this channel are endlessly replayable, and I hope that you'll join me in that discussion. So, with that said, let's discuss Undertale. Despite the many times I've replayed this game, I still don't seem to get bored of Undertale. The story and the way it incorporates the choices you make into it is something I find worth appreciating, even if I mostly just do the pacifist route whenever I replay the game. One of the many examples of the game incorporating your choices into its story is through the way it gives you the choice to either spare or kill enemies both during boss fights and regular enemy encounters, of which upon revisiting, I find that the process of learning the enemy's attacks and dodging them accordingly is an enjoyable and rewarding experience, while still being a masterful way of presenting the importance and impact of the player's decisions without overwhelming them. Furthermore, by allowing you to experiment with your choices and gain knowledge on where the differing paths can take you, the game adds a lot of replay value in my opinion. For example, some boss fights may be harder depending on the route that you're on. Some fights are specific to certain routes, and you may not even meet some characters depending on the route that you're on. Whether you're someone who prefers to experiment with the different choices that the game presents, or you simply prefer to do the same route whenever you revisit the game, Undertale is a game that wants you to revisit it regardless of how you play the game. It includes a lot of small and convenient details to accommodate replay value, which I find worth in appreciating. For example, if you decide to replay the game after beating Flowey, various lines of dialogue will change within the game. The boss fight with Omega Flowey is skipped, as well as other smaller parts of the game that may get tiresome when replaying the game. The enemy encounters can certainly get in the way at times, but in my experience, they don't happen to an overwhelming degree. With every enemy having different ways that you need to act in order to befriend them, the encounters are kept interesting and somewhat rewarding, as learning how to approach a certain enemy allows you to spare them quicker if you've experimented and learned how to do so on prior encounters. The game also does a good job at differentiating the boss battles and the regular enemy encounters, as they introduce different mechanics throughout the game. For example, the fight with Papyrus turns your soul blue, which requires more platforming. These gimmicks make the boss fights more memorable in my opinion, as most of the fights have something unique that differentiates them from each other. The story is also something I can't help but appreciate whenever I replay this game, as understanding the many references it may make to future events that we wouldn't have context to until later playthroughs, or from different routes entirely, make revisiting the story a lot more interesting in my opinion. Another thing I appreciate about the story is that the game does an extraordinary job at managing its tone. There are a lot of witty and light-hearted moments within, but the game knows when not to interject them into an otherwise serious and important part of the plot, and I find that makes the both light-hearted and more serious moments more memorable in their own right. Overall, Undertale is a game that I find worth in revisiting from time to time, as I think that the story is cleverly written to include a lot of details that are bound to pique your interest, and the gameplay offers an engaging and rewarding experience. With that in mind, I want to talk about Undertale Yellow and how it applies those principles to create something of its own, in which one of the things I always find myself appreciating when it comes to replaying this game is the storytelling and how it interconnects the core elements of Undertale's plot while still managing to tell its own story. As the player, we already know what will become of Clover with the hindsight of Undertale, hence this game places a lot of emphasis on their journey and the characters they meet throughout. Not only does this make it more memorable, but it also gives the ending more impact as well, with even characters like Flowey, who's mostly known for being a sociopath, gaining respect for Clover, and whether it's because he knows he can just undo everything to try and change the outcome, or because by that point he's realized that this isn't Clover's story to finish, he lets them rest. I also think that the game does a good job at balancing the commitment of staying true to its source material while still giving itself enough of an avenue to take the story into a direction of its own. For example, it's heavily implied that Frisk and Clover travel through different paths of the ruins, which leads them to different areas of Snowdin and subsequently different areas of the underground, with Frisk being able to proceed straight into the caverns while Clover has to take a detour through the dunes and subsequently the Wild East, which is where the 6th shooter minigame can be played for those who want to earn more gold. In my original video, I mentioned that this minigame's inclusion made regular enemy encounters somewhat pointless, as you could easily earn more gold through this method. Looking back, I don't find myself agreeing with that sentiment for a variety of reasons. Firstly, 6th shooter doesn't seem to be intended as a replacement to regular enemy encounters, especially as it becomes available to you quite late into the game. Furthermore, retrospectively looking back at the way I used to approach them, the slight annoyance I felt whenever one occurred stemmed from the fact that I would just run away from them in hopes of making my way to the next area of the story in a hasty manner, which increases the susceptibility of regular enemy encounters. To avoid the inconvenience of enemy encounters occurring more often, you're likely just better off trying to understand how to approach them, not only for future reference if you encounter the same enemy again, but also to avoid enemy encounters occurring more often. As mentioned, enemy encounters are a good way of encouraging experimentation and can be a rewarding experience upon revisiting the game. I think that it's worth highlighting that these games want you to avoid rushing through them to reach the end, as doing so may lead to you appreciating them less than you otherwise would have had you taken the time to explore and experience what the game has to offer, and enemy encounters, whether you love them or hate them, are a core part of that experience. Just because you can skip them, it doesn't mean that you always should, and in a subtle way, the game punishes you if you overuse that ability, as enemies will not leave you alone if you continuously run away. In my opinion, this could be somewhat indicative of the fact that the game wants you to slow down to try and understand its battle system and where it can lead you. Looking back, I think that's an element I just didn't see at the time. With that in mind, I think it's worth mentioning that how often these enemy encounters occur is something that should be handled with moderation, which I think that these games achieve quite well. If they happen too often, then they'll lose their charm and become annoying at that point, as they just be hindering regular traversal and one's ability to move through the story at a natural pace. I also think that the gameplay follows a lot of similar principles to Undertale, with it even slightly expanding upon them as seen with the ability to sprint, which makes moving around the map more easier and convenient. Another example of the game delivering on those principles is the tickle meter and the deflecting mechanics in the boss fight with Axis, among many other similar gimmicks in boss fights. Once more, it sets the boss fights apart from regular enemy encounters and makes them a lot more memorable as a result. In my respective video about this game, I said that it can be quite difficult at times, and upon revisiting the game, I definitely didn't have as much of a hard time with it than I previously may have. However, this is a subjective matter overall and very dependent on each player and their own experience with the game. It's worth noting that the game does have an easy mode which increases Clover's defense, hence decreasing the amount of damage they take. Overall, Undertale Yellow is a game that I still enjoy revisiting, and 1 year after its initial release, it's a game that I find myself appreciating more. It uses its source material to evoke a sense of familiarity within the player, but overall uses its own cast of characters, the gameplay and its interpretation of Undertale's world to tell a story of its own, all while applying, enhancing and somewhat expanding upon the principles of its source material. With discussion of Undertale Yellow being out of the way, I want to talk about a smaller fan game that's a much shorter experience, but still worth mentioning. Over time, despite being a reskin of Undertale, is a game that manages to work within the limitations that come with being as such to create a world and characters of its own, with some interesting gameplay features to add variety to the game, much like how the aforementioned games have done so with their boss fights, namely the boss fight with Jane requiring you to constantly bounce and dodge attacks under those conditions. Once more, I don't necessarily align with my prior views about the enemy encounters being tiresome as described in my initial video about this game, which is similar to the reasons discussed in the Undertale Yellow section of this video. They mostly stemmed from the way I approached the enemy encounters, which has changed over time. Overall, despite Overtime being a much smaller and shorter game compared to Undertale or Undertale Yellow, I still find worth in revisiting it, as it's a game that does a good job at combining Undertale and Team Fortress 2 into a world that can call its own. No matter how much time passes, it does seem like Undertale is a game I don't get bored of revisiting. The world, its gameplay, music and many other factors make it an enjoyable experience regardless of whether it's your first time playing or your second. The fan games I've discussed in this video are ones I find worth in revisiting as well, as they're really enjoyable experiences that manage to apply Undertale's principles in their own way, both in terms of the gameplay and the story. So, there's the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I've still got a few more videos I want to release before the year is over, so hopefully they'll come out in time and hopefully you'll enjoy those too. If you want to view the list of games I want to make videos about in the future, then you can always do so through the link in the description. Additionally, if you want to follow me, then my socials will be linked in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I haven't really got much else I want to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.